Now, a few words about Jason. He's a former Army intelligence officer who served in Afghanistan, a Democrat and trained lawyer. He was elected to the Missouri State Legislature in 2008, and 4 years later rose to Secretary of State, becoming, at 32, the youngest statewide elected official in the nation at the time. 4 years after that, he narrowly lost a bid for a U.S. Senate seat. Next, he established a national organization called Let America Vote, aimed at countering voter suppression. And he began preparing to run for president of the United States. But instead, in 2018, he entered the race for mayor of Kansas City. 3 months later, though, he abruptly pulled out to seek treatment for post-traumatic stress and depression dating from his military service in Afghanistan. Nowadays, he helps combat veteran suicide and veteran homelessness as president of national expansion at the Veterans Community Project, and he hosts a popular political podcast called Majority 54. As many of you may recall, Jason, at the height of his political notoriety 4 years ago, released what became a best-selling memoir, Outside the Wire, reflecting on lessons learned in his military and public service. His new book tells a very different, more painful, and complicated story about his struggle with mental illness resulting from PTSD that went undiagnosed for far too long. It was a struggle that derailed his political career, but it also has set him on a path of surmounting his own health challenges, working to destigmatize PTSD, and helping others with similar traumas. Jason's book is enormously revealing, thoughtful, and moving, and among its many attributes is the inclusion throughout of sections written by Jason's wife, Diana, offering her own perspective on what was happening. A review in Publishers Weekly said Jason displays a level of vulnerability not often seen in political memoirs, and predicted that readers will appreciate the candor of this harrowing tale. And a Kirkus review highlighted Jason's very relevant and urgent advice: either you deal with your trauma or your trauma deals with you. In conversation with Jason will be Don Calloway, who's the CEO of the DC lobbying firm Pine Street Strategies, and a commentator on MSNBC. And he also goes back a ways with Jason, that they were in the Missouri State House together. So please join me in welcoming Jason and Don.
Hey, shout out to the STL cap in the red. I see you. Perhaps I should have shouted out my wife first, but hey, you know. Hey,
Hi, Deanna.
Thank you.
Beat you to
Thank you. I'm Don Calloway. I'm going to be quiet and just give the floor to, first of all, you all who came out to hang out with my buddy here, who's now published his second, we claim it in advance, New York Times best-selling book, Invisible Storm. Yes, please give it up for JK and Invisible Storm. Can you all hear me without this? Do I need it for recording? Okay.
Yeah.
We go back quite a bit, like authentically, like
Not like politics we go back.
correct. We're actually like your dirty socks on the floor of my room. That's a real
We used to
thing.
hang stuff from the fan.
Correct. That is correct. We were roommates in the state legislature in Jefferson City many, many years ago when I was 28, a wise old 28 representing St. Louis, and my rival / counterpart from Kansas City, a spry, ambitious 27-year-old from across the state, JK. And we became roommates and fast friends. And all the biography stuff aside, I think folks know who you are. I'm asking what I will find myself asking a lot of my friends, particularly post-pandemic. How are you? And don't give me the trite answer, because I think everybody's a little different after I could say the last 2 years, but really the last 6 weeks. So how you doing, man?
I'm doing really well. Like I try, actually, it's funny you say it that way. I try when people ask me that question now to pause and think about it before I answer for two reasons. One, I kind of learned, like, don't just say I'm good. and to think about it. It's an opportunity to think about it. And the other reason is because when you tell the whole world that you have PTSD, there's like more weight behind that question. Like, because people are like, are you okay? And when they say, how are you? So I try to give an authentic answer. And yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Like, it's kind of a stressful week, but it's a fun week. And, I'm doing really well.
Well, I good. I'm glad. I'm not gonna just move on. Good. I'm glad to hear you're well, my
And
friend.
that was it. Thank you for coming. He's okay. You can go.
I am genuinely glad to hear that you're doing well. I think that one of the major themes of the book for me, and I finished it today, like I raced through it, and it was really fantastic. And I've known you forever, but some of this insight, it's so far deeper beyond the headlines, right? To see how you were actually feeling at these moments in which, we were all there and you were like on top of the world. But one of the things that struck me was that we tend to contextualize PTSD in the military context, and specifically for those who are returning from, the downrange, so to speak, and actual seeing battle, which you did in Afghanistan. But I think that the book is important because it becomes very clear that trauma is universal, and it doesn't have to be about the soldier or those who have experienced, physical violence and such. And there are these little moments throughout that kind of parallel to moments you had in Afghanistan, like, whoa, I felt this exact same way in civilian life, right? And so why should the general public who are not Jason Kander devotees, right? Why should people care about this? What is the larger message about trauma and like being honest with oneself about finding a way to deal with it?
Yeah, I think that's the right question. And it's something like this week, as I've been going on TV and selling the book and stuff, that's part of the challenge, is getting that across. Because there's it's pretty clear what the different genres or what the verticals are for this book, right? Like, there's people who buy books the way my dad buys books, right? It's like, oh, it's a book about war. Got it, right? And the way a lot of people's dads, and to some extent me now, I'm getting to be that age. And then there's the folks who, they buy books because they're, interested in politics. And some of those people buy books because they're just buying because they're mad, And it's like, they're like, I'm angry and I can't vote yet. I will buy that book. So there's that genre. But, I didn't really want to write either of those books because the people who might really need to hear the mental health part of it, what if they don't buy those books, right? For instance, I'm not trying to stereotype, but not that many women buy probably Stephen Kuntz and Tom Clancy books, right? They're not looking to read a book that's just about, so no shit, there I was, but I want to reach everybody. I wanted to reach women too and talk about mental health. So that's why the first 2 chapters are going into the Army, I go to Afghanistan, and then it's okay, now we're back in this world and we're dealing with that stuff. Because, had to establish what that was, but I didn't want to spend the whole book there. And so I do think that it is something that everybody can relate to. And then the challenge becomes, how do I get that across when I'm talking about the book? And I think what I've kind of come to this week, and people have responded to, is I started with, look, we all encounter trauma in our lives, right? And I talk about how it could be a car accident, it could be a bad divorce, it could be you lost a loved one. But I actually think what's resonated more with people, to your point about the last 6 weeks, is I just say, look, we're living in a traumatized state all the time. And so there's stuff in, and this is also based on feedback I've got from people who read the book. There's just stuff in there that everybody can use. There's a bunch of, there's a part of the struggle of the book for me is little things, getting to a point where I can go into a restaurant and I can, sit with my back to the door and, deal with it. But that's particular to me as somebody who did the work I did. But I think we're all a lot less likely to take our kids to a parade this week than we were last week. And we're all sort of sitting in places and taking a look at everybody that comes in. And so we're living through a traumatized time, which is not a good thing at all. And, if there's a way that this book can be helpful to people, because it's just look, I'm a buddy I work with. I told Don before this, I was like, don't worry about your questions. I'm going to talk way too long anyway. a buddy I work with, I work at Veterans Community Project, like Brad said. By the way, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Politics and Prose. I appreciate this very much. Yeah, no, your instinct was right. You can clap. He said to me a few days ago, because a lot of the guys I work with are veterans, but also veterans of the PTSD clinic in Kansas City. And he was like, yeah, you got PTSD. Real big deal around here. And, he was like, so does everybody. But his point was, he was like, but then he was saying, but he goes, if I wrote a book about it, probably people wouldn't read it. He's like, but you went on a journey that people will read. So it's like a struggle because I want people to read the book, which means you got to tell them about this, the rather coming of age tale of pursuing the presidency while dealing with an untreated, undiagnosed secret psychological disorder, which not a story that's been told a lot. But really, I'm just trying to get people to the third act where they're in therapy with me. That's the book I want everybody to read, and that's accessible and that can help everybody. But to get there, you got to tell them what has been kind of a wild story.
You and I spent some nondescript days in South Carolina, like not trying to tweet that we were there, walking around. I know I'm here to introduce you to black folk. No, I'm joking. Kind of, not really, but we've been friends long enough that
he ain't joking.
No, you and I spent a lot of time in South Carolina, and I have some South Carolina roots.
Yeah.
I'll move on. So
don't move on. It's fine.
But it was in service of something that the word you mentioned in your previous answer, ambition, right? And we all knew that of our cohort,
Can I tell a quick story about that trip before I do? Before you go on?
If you must.
No, you come off great.
Go proceed.
I get to the airport in D.C. Don and I are gonna go down. You know what I'm gonna say? So I'm sitting there. We're in the gate area, getting ready to go to South Carolina. Now, I had already worked Iowa and New Hampshire a bunch, so this was like, okay, we're gonna go start working in South Carolina, and I like colorful socks, right? And Don, he walks up to me. Don's always been working on how I dress anyway, and he walks up and he goes, oh. And I'm like, what? And he goes, your socks. And I'm like, what's the matter with it? And he's like, that's not gonna work, man. And I was like, well, what do you want me to do about it? And he goes into his bag and he pulls out a brand new pair of socks that are just very nondescript, and he throws them to me. And I'm like, man, I don't want to take your socks. And he goes, you think those are my socks? And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, I knew you'd do this shit. I bought some socks. He goes, I got a bunch of them in here. I knew you'd do this. Anyway.
Listen, when you think your boy is about to be the president, you tend to, make some sacrifices and plan in advance. I wanted to be ambassador to the Bahamas. So anyway, moving on. You had a really good riff on ambition. And to contextualize, we knew, and I would say the royal we, our generation of politicians, right? We kind of knew that you were the person in our cohort who had a shot at being the first person. Like Barack was our guy, but he wasn't exactly our generation. He's like, like if you were your parents' accident younger sibling, and he was like in high school when you were in elementary. So he wasn't exactly one of us. We knew that Jason was the first one of us, right? And so you were special, but you have an interesting riff on ambition in the chapter. I think it's Young Man in a Hurry, in which you talk about ambition as not necessarily a negative thing, right? Something that needs to be managed. But can you break that down? Because we tend to, D.C. is an ambitious city, type A, everybody's a runner. And can you talk about, like, ambition is not a terrible thing?
Yeah. No, it's a really great question. And it actually is a good segue to, so my first cousin, Sam Ashworth, is here, and probably didn't want to be recognized. But raise your hand if you've gotten through the book already. A few. Okay, great. So just a few of you. So if you get all the way through, there's actually a couple people here, 3 of them who are in the acknowledgments. Will Knatzer's here, Kellen's here. When you get it, you be like, oh, I met those people. But anyway, Sam is a writer, like a really, really, really good writer, and I can write. But he's a writer, and so Sam was my coach and collaborator through this, and I mention it here because Sam, that's one of the passages Sam really helped me craft, which he hates it when I say that he had anything to do with it. He's like, that's not how this works. But what we're talking about there, what I was talking about there is the idea that everybody likes to shame politicians for ambition, but like as if any politicians aren't ambitious. Like, I don't, like, yeah, maybe you got elected.
Any professionals,
or
like yeah.
Right, and that was the point. Is like you start with, look, all politicians are ambitious. They're all saying like, hey, give me power. But then beyond that, like, there's a bunch of professionals that are like entrepreneurs are like, you got to be starting the next thing, right? You got to be ambitious in order to do it. Like, nobody shames football players for being ambitious. Like, but they'd like to make a professional roster. You know, comedians need to figure out their next special. Like, nobody is like, I hate how ambitious this, you know, this person is. But there are these professions where you have to be imagining the next thing. You have to be working toward the next thing to conquer in order to stay in it at all. And the other point that I think is important from that passage is that, you know, we're very selective about who we have a problem with their ambition. You know, like Joe Biden was too ambitious when he was running and he was young, and then he's running and he's older, and nobody's like, you know, Joe Biden, he's just too ambitious. Like, you just don't hear that, right? However, it's gender-based too, because Hillary Clinton, like, why? What's the difference? I mean, she was like the most qualified person to ever run, right? But they're like, she's just too ambitious, you know? But Bernie Sanders had run more than once, and people were not like, he's just too ambitious, Bernie Sanders. So the point of the whole thing was that, like, ambition isn't necessarily a bad thing. Don't let people put that on you. Now, that said, my ambition was wrapped up in ambition, but also like workaholism, where I was trying to avoid myself. So, which is the deeper layer of the book. But
can you talk a little bit about fatherhood? Because we came into this game like not
children.
exactly.
We were children.
Yeah. And now we have them, and I have.
We had no gray hair.
There was none of that.
You were already a very good dresser.
We had working knees. We used to play basketball.
Yeah. Oh my God, we did.
Yeah,
I've learned a lot about, you know, how to dress from you, and you're still better at it. Yeah.
And my wife would be very proud. She's laughed out loud. That was so disrespectful. That was so disrespectful.
But to be fair, like, she's a fashion designer.
She is.
You don't think we're going to talk about that afterwards?
So
Have I been learning from the wrong place?
No, you've not. Let's you gotta gotta crawl. So I have seen fatherhood inform your journey as like a professional, but also as a public servant. And can you talk about when you knew there were some issues, and when you knew you kind of had to stop running from the mental health issue, the invisible storm that was building? How much did fatherhood have to do with you, like, stopping and getting help, and how much were True and Bella kind of a part of this? I've got to get this under control.
A huge part, and particularly True, because, you know, Bella came along after I got help. So, and we never would have had a second kid if I didn't go get better, right? But, you know, one of the big struggles for me over those 11 years, it was the ability to be present. And Diana would say to me all the time, I'd love to spend some time with you in the present. And I would say, well, I need your help to do that. And the only thing that would make me feel present, that would quiet the invisible storm, was performing, you know, whether it was a big interview or it was, or even if it wasn't performing, like really being engaged and fully utilized to go after the next thing, sitting in a meeting with a major donor who we really needed. Kellen was usually there for that, having to deal with me, and or, you know, going on TV for a big interview with high stakes or giving a big speech. I felt fully present and utilized in those situations, just like I did in Afghanistan, because it brought everything to bear, and it involved adrenaline, and then everything else in between. Diana, I know Brad pointed out that there's a lot of first-person passages from Diana in the book. In one of them, she said that, you know, everything in between me being on was like, you know, like being on, that was being in the Matrix, and everything else I was on the Nebuchadnezzar, just gray, sullen. I couldn't really be there. And that became really focused and clear for me, and really upsetting when I became a dad, because I could see other dads who I knew I loved my son, but it was like that love was like just on the other side of a thin wall. And, you know, like I have an example in the book about how one time, you know, when we were potty training True, he peed in the toilet, and he was really proud of himself, and we were celebrating, and he ran out into the living room, and he was like, I peed, and he threw his arms up in the air to celebrate, and he pooped on the floor. and I remember laughing, but not fully laughing, because I remember thinking, like, I know this is funny, and I know this is a joyous occasion. I know this is a special memory, and I can't fully access it. You know, it was just, and what that comes from, I learned later in therapy, is that's emotional numbness, and it's part of PTSD often. It's part of trauma often, and the way you get to emotional numbness is when you have a lot of negative emotions and a lot of intrusive memories and feelings all the time and thoughts, you don't want to feel those, right? Which is a lot of what I did for 11 years, is I avoided them, but I also suppressed them. But the thing is like the countermeasures you have to suppress those negative emotions, they're not like smart bombs, right? They're just like, you just carpet bomb your emotions because you can't just pick the negative ones. And so what happens is you suppress all emotions, and eventually you just, for me, like, I just couldn't feel joy. I couldn't feel anything. And so having a son and you know, becoming a dad really crystallized for me and helped me understand, like, that I wasn't participating in my own life and that I was missing stuff. And it made me feel like a terrible dad, because I'd see other dads who clearly were fully present with their son or their daughter, and I wasn't. And I have an amazing relationship with my dad still, and I wanted to be a great dad, and I knew I wasn't, and that was very motivating for me.
So, two quick questions. We talked about the kid, and we have to give a moment for you to ruminate on the magnificence of the uncredited author, co-author of this book. And I think it's interesting. Obviously, Diana's perspective is fascinating through the whole thing, because I think, as most guys are, we generally are caught in our own worlds and thinking about, you know, I can't see past my, you know, whatever on any given day, right? Concerned generally with myself. So it's fascinating to hear the perspective of somebody who this is affecting as much as it is you, and she's been with you since you were 17, right? So that aspect was fascinating, but also just this piece of, I kind of forgot what I was going to say as the second part, but I do want you to talk about how important Diana has been. I pivoted smoothly, but still, the point is, how important has Diana been for all of this with you? And what made you, as an author, decide to essentially share the platform of the book with her?
So when we had the initial, I say we because it was me and her, when we had the initial idea for the book, it actually started with, and some of you may have read this at some point, she and I published an article where it was sort of half me, half her, talking about trauma. And there was a very strong response to it. And so we were like, okay, maybe that's the idea for the book, and it was to go back and forth. And then it kind of became clear over time that it wouldn't really work if it were a fully 50-50, because, you know, I mean, realistically, it was probably my story, the name people were more likely to know, that might bring people to the book. So, but we didn't want to leave that idea behind, and I particularly didn't want to leave that behind, because there's a device in the book that's really important that we really struggled with to make happen. And the device is, and it was very hard to do, is that as you go through the book, what doesn't happen is there's no part where we say, you know, oh, and here's why this is happening. Like, what you know as you go through the book is what I knew at the time. So chronologically, as you move through the book, I, as the narrator, we had to have the discipline to not use the language and the vocabulary that I have since learned in therapy to describe what was happening. So instead of saying that I was hypervigilant, I'm just explaining to you that there was danger everywhere, right? Well, as a narrator, that allows you to understand the world through my eyes and have a better opportunity to understand what PTSD feels like. But after a while, you might be like, how does this dude not know he's crazy, right? And why does he feel that that situation is dangerous when that situation seems to me to objectively not be dangerous? Like, you know, once I'm home in Kansas City. So that was another reason why it was really helpful to have an additional narrator, to have somebody who was with me and could tell you what was happening around me and could explain to you how I was behaving so that you could get a better sense for it. That's one reason. Another reason is, anybody who's ever been around any sort of mental health challenge, which is everybody in this room and every room, knows that you don't do it by yourself. Like, it affects the entire family. And it affected Diana greatly. And that was the other thing we wanted to talk about, because when I went into therapy, after a few weeks of therapy, it's when my therapist, Nick, who you get to know well in the book, said, I think Diana should maybe see somebody too. And he introduced us to the concept that we did not know about, which was secondary post-traumatic stress. So in the category of me just being a real treat for 11 years, in addition to being physically gone a lot and, mentally not present when I'm there, I also gave my wife the gift of post-traumatic stress, which is, if you're thinking about what to do for an anniversary.
From me to you.
Yeah, here you go, wrapped up in a little box. I didn't know that I was doing this, but, even though she didn't go to Afghanistan with me, so she didn't experience the underlying trauma, when you are, laying next to somebody at night who's having really severe night terrors and that have become sleep paralysis, and so as a result, you have to sleep kind of light so that you can shake them awake if it's happening. Diana used to joke that she was my service animal because she had to do this for me. And then I'm waking up and I'm telling you about them and you're half asleep and it's really getting in there. And then whenever I'm gone, or even when I'm there, I'm preaching to you about all the safety precautions we have to have and what we got to do to secure the house, and don't answer the door without me there and all this. And meanwhile, our public profile is going up, and we're the most high-profile Jewish family in a state that has a history of some anti-Semitic violence. All that comes together, and all of a sudden, you have all the symptoms of post-traumatic stress without the underlying trauma. I would like to pause at this point and say that the book is also funny. Because I feel like if I were sitting where you are at this point, I would be like, I am not buying this book. But in order to get you through all this, there's a lot of levity. You will laugh for two reasons. One, I wanted to get you through the book, okay? And two, look, I come from the military. Dark gallows humor is what we do. And if you step back from it for a second, even I can tell you that a dude running for president while he's stalking his house at night because he's convinced there's an intruder is objectively pretty hilarious. All right? And so it's important to know that it's also funny. So
It is very funny, actually. But you, and I'll open it up, make it more interactive after this. You talked a little bit toward the end about something that Malcolm Gladwell writes about in Outliers, I believe. People find their best and highest selves through this concept of worthwhile work done well, right? Being good at something that's worth doing. I'm good at a lot of stuff, but not much of it is worthwhile stuff, right? But we see you, those of us who've been watching you for a long time, not elected office, and that provides some sense of relief to you as well as us. But this idea of Veterans Community Project, that to me kind of embodies worthwhile. There's no higher mission, and you seem to be really, really good at it. So can you take a minute and explain what you're doing every day with VCP, in addition to the punditry and the authoring and the talking? But the 9 to 5 is VCP, and break down what that is.
Yeah, thanks, man. So I'm the president of National Expansion at Veterans Community Project, which is essentially a character in the book, in the third act per se of the book, because when I was running for mayor and Kellen was managing that campaign, Kellen was trying very hard to have me have a good time. The campaign was objectively going extremely well. We were going to win. And she would say often to me, "Isn't this great?" And I would be like, "Yeah, it's fine." Whatever. Because I was just getting worse and worse and worse. And there was one really good day for me on that campaign, which lasted all of 99 days. There was one really good day, and it was the day I toured Veterans Community Project. Veterans Community Project is an organization based in Kansas City, founded by some fellow combat veterans, not myself. It was before my time. But they founded the organization, and what it does is two things. It focuses on combating veteran suicide and combating veterans homelessness, and it does it by creating outreach centers that any veteran can access regardless of the nature of their service and qualify for 100% of their services. And then the other thing is, or much better known for, is we create villages of tiny houses that serve as with wraparound case management services that transition people out of homelessness and homeless veterans and transition them into permanent housing. So that's what the organization is. Now that said, that's an awesome mission, and I could tell that they executed it very well. That was attractive, but in politics, I've toured hundreds of nonprofits. What like kind of knocked me over about the place was the vibe. I describe it as like a Silicon Valley startup and a forward operating base in Afghanistan had a baby. It was like super dark humor where you knew people cared about you because they were kind of mean, just like a barracks. But at the same time, deeply innovative, right? Like this is a place where when the guys built, a conference room, when they first started, they were like, I guess we need a conference table. They looked them up. They're like $4,000. They're like, we're not going to do that. So they built a conference table, had sponsors come in and sign it, and they raised like $60,000 for the conference table, right? So it's that kind of place. It's really cool. So I went home the night that we toured it, and I said to Diana, I was like, oh, I wish I could just quit everything and go work there. But it wasn't a realistic notion, right? I mean, all of you are familiar with this concept where like maybe some of you are corporate lawyers or you're something else where like you see something and you want to chase it, but you're like, it's not really what I do for a living. I was a politician, so I just went back to campaigning. 6 weeks later, I end up in the on suicide watch in the psych ward at the Kansas City VA, as one does, and they're telling me like it's going to be 4 or 5 months before you can get access to the VA and get the services that you want because there's a process for getting enrolled. And I wasn't sure what to do. So I call up Brian Meyer, one of the co-founders of VCP, who was a friend of ours. And I'm like, I explained this to him. I'm like, hey, I'm announcing this to the world tomorrow, but they're telling me I'm not going to get in. And he's like, well, come on down. So 6 weeks after the VIP You're Going to Be Mayor tour, I go through the outreach center like thousands of other vets in Kansas City. They expedite my paperwork, and a week later, I start weekly therapy at the VA. So I was a believer before, but now I'm really a believer. I started hanging around, and at this time, Veterans Community Project is getting asked by communities all over the country to come and replicate what they've done in Kansas City because they've made a bigger dent in veterans homelessness than really anybody's seen anywhere. And they were having some starts and some, not starts, like kind of figuring that out. And, we had created Let America Vote before, so I knew how to I had some idea of how to create a national organization. So I'm hanging around, taking cool T-shirts that they made, borrowing hats, growing a beard so people won't recognize me, and giving advice about how to grow a national organization. And finally, after a few months, I'm doing well in therapy, and Brian, one of the co-founders, is the CEO, is like, hey, man, you're not working. You don't know what you're going to do next. You're here a lot. Instead of just giving us advice, why don't you come in full time? So that's how I became the president of National Expansion. And in the last few years, we have now expanded to the Denver area, to Sioux Falls, to St. Louis, and we've just bought land in Oklahoma City, and then we've got some other announcements coming soon. And it is by far the best civilian job I've ever had. It is, to your original question, which I appreciate, I get, and one of you is preparing to ask this, it's fine, I'll answer it. I get the, are you going to run for something again all the time? And it's funny because the very first thing I think of is what I do right now, because I'm no different than anybody else. When I think about whether to try and do another job, I'm just like, first question is, do I like the job I have? And it's the best civilian job I've ever had. I love doing it. It gives me the opportunity every day to be a part of helping veterans come home again, which is what I got into all this stuff and got into the Army to do in the first place. So it's a great organization.
Fantastic. Thank you, man.
And I should add,
what's the website?
Yeah, thank you. It's vcp.org, veteranscommunityproject.org, and all of my royalties from this book go to VCP. So buy 4, if you would. Unless you hate veterans, then only buy 1. But you could buy 4 if you like veterans.
Awesome. Well, please, you all come ask questions, come state your opinion, whatever it may be.
Mostly ask questions.
We got some time.
Hi. Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I came because I saw you on MSNBC, and I have an affinity for veteran suicide prevention and first responder suicide prevention.
What's your name, if you don't mind?
My name is Lee Boswell.
Okay.
I worked for the Fairfax County Fire Department here in Northern Virginia for 27 years. And in 2014, out of nowhere, I had a grand mal seizure and was diagnosed with epilepsy and was forced into retirement. It was horrible. Like, I'd been a firefighter since I was 19 years old.
Yeah.
I did not know what to do with myself. So I decided to start eating and drinking and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And I kind of got focused on the 9/11 healthcare bill, and I was working on that on Capitol Hill. And then I got involved with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention after we lost one of our firefighters. So I can appreciate what you're saying about hypervigilance. I had all of this energy focused outwards, trying to find out who I was. Meanwhile, I was depressed as shit because I'd lost my career. I woke up in 2019, I weighed 276 pounds, and it was not good, not good. So I bottomed out, said, I'm going to fix this. June 5th, I did my first sprint triathlon.
That's awesome.
So I was able, not unlike you, to take my fitness and help me process that.
Yeah.
So just to give you a little background on who I am and why this matters to me. But I have a gift for you, and I also have a question.
Okay, thanks.
I'm on TikTok, social media. I see these things all the time. I have this thing here in my gut, this growing concern about so many of our veterans who are coming back and not doing what you did and acknowledging that they have had trauma, they have PTSD, and I see them all the time on TikTok making threats. You know, you just wait. All of us vets were pissed off when without 17,000 vets are pissed off, and I have this growing sense that so many of our veterans are coming back and not getting help, and something bad's going to happen. So I applaud you because there is no greater way to touch your peers, you know, peer-to-peer contact for veterans, first responders, etc., and normalizing mental health issues, especially with humor. That's like 2 thumbs up, man. That is the best because you make people feel normal, whether they're a vet, whether they're a firefighter, whether they work at TRW or whatever. So kudos to you. And I do have, this is a challenge coin that I designed myself. It was the first one for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I carry these with me when I meet people who have struggled. You can keep it or you can pass it on. Because as long as, I tell people you stick this in your wallet, you stick it in your pocket, as long as you have this, you know there's some random person out there that cares about you. So if you meet someone else and you think they need it more, then pass it on.
Okay, here, we'll do it right. Exactly. Thank you. Can I give you a hug? Is that okay? Thank you. It's Lee? You said Lee? Lee, thank you for this and for sharing your story. I really appreciate it a lot. It's pretty incredible. Here's what I want to say about that. To me, the most important part of what you just said was, what year was it that you had to leave the fire department? 2015. Some people in here will get what I mean. That's a trauma in and of itself. And it's because you said you lost your career. You lost your idea of who you were at that moment. And that's one of the things that I talk about in this book is that, raise your hand if you served in the military here. Okay. What's up, Frost? Yeah, all right. I didn't see it till just now. Colonel Frost, which is so diminishing to me. It's incredible. Anyway, so not very many of you. So it's hard to explain because if you never served, you might have or if you're never firefighter, that kind of thing, you might look at that and go, I mean, that seems really hard. Like, it doesn't seem like something that it would be that hard to leave it. It seems like, boy, you'd be really happy to get out of that service and go do a job that's not as difficult. But the thing is at least in my case, and I think it's true for a lot of folks, when you're struggling with trauma, and one of the things that happens is you don't like who you are very much because you feel like, what right do I have to have these feelings? And in my case, it was like 2 things going in different directions. My ego never suffered. Perhaps that's obvious. My ego never suffered. My self-confidence never suffered, okay? I never felt like I was anything less than the best at what I did. I never felt like I wasn't. That was never a problem for me. But my esteem, my idea of what kind of a human being I was, and this is common with people who have survived trauma, was extremely low, and it was getting lower and lower and lower all the time. So in 2011, when I left the military, it was like the part of me that I still liked and respected died the day that I left. And the story of me, I didn't understand what it was. I didn't know how to write it. Because, yeah, like I did politics and I was a lawyer or whatever. But all those things, in my mind, I was a soldier who did those things. Hell, my book is a soldier's memoir. Like, that's my idea of who I am. It's not a veteran's memoir. It's a soldier's memoir, right? So when you leave the fire department, that's extremely similar, and you clearly know this, why you brought it up, to when a lot of people leave the military. And there's other jobs like this. Athletes experience this. There's all sorts of different things where your idea of who you are is wrapped up in this. That in and of itself can be a trauma. Your question about veterans in particular, it's a good opportunity to explain sort of because implicit in your question is these people are not getting help. Why are they not getting help? Why do a lot of veterans not understand that they need to go get help for this? This is usually characterized as, and you didn't do this, so I don't mean you, but usually the way we think about this is, how do we explain to veterans that it is an act of strength, not an act of weakness, to go get help, right? That's the way we talk about it. And look, frankly, we've been having that conversation long enough. Most veterans get that it is act of strength, not of weakness. They hear it enough. We are bought into it. Most of us get that. The problem is twofold. One, we do not believe, almost to a person, we do not believe that what we did justifies in any way having any kind of trauma, because it didn't count. And the reason we don't think it counted is because the moment you get off the bus at basic, they explain to you that what you're doing ain't shit. It is no big deal. Frost is nodding. It's no big deal. And I sound like I'm being very critical. I'm not. You got to do that. If you want me to keep going back into rooms where I might get my head cut off on YouTube, right, by a bad guy because I don't know who it is I'm meeting with and I don't really know what they have in mind, or if you want me to, or if you want, other folks to go back on a patrol when they got shot at the day before or whatever, we got to believe that what we're doing is no big deal. Otherwise, we're not going to go do it, right? You're not going to be able to make your legs carry you into that room or out on that patrol. So it's a necessary form of brainwashing. These jobs, same as firefighting, these jobs are dangerous and they're hard. And if you want people to keep doing them, they got to believe that. But here's the problem, and here's where I will be critical of the military. We don't flip that switch off when folks leave. We don't sit people down and go, hey, actually, that was some crazy shit. And you're probably going to deal with some things, because that was a big deal, and it wasn't normal. I know we told you it was. We were lying. It is actually quite a big deal, right? And so when you come home, it's not that you think it's not manly or whatever to go get help. You're just convinced, because you have it on very good authority, that what you did was no big deal. And you definitely know somebody who went through something worse. You know somebody who got shot. And if you got shot,
didn't come back.
Yeah, you know somebody who got killed, right. And so what right do you have is what you tell yourself. That's the first thing. The second reason that I think folks don't get help, and both of these things are what I'm trying to do something about with this book, is every depiction out there of PTSD is what I call PTSD porn, all right? Which is, it's voyeurism, especially in the movies and on TV. It's simple. It's somebody who hasn't had treatment, and they are robbing a bank after they beat their spouse and use drugs, okay? That's how it is depicted. And oftentimes they die in the end, all right? That means that what we're taught is that PTSD is terminal, is that it is a terminal diagnosis, and that if it is somehow something you live through, it will end your career, so it's a terminal career diagnosis. Well, who in their right mind, if they think that's the case, is going to go get diagnosed with this and then get help? Just about nobody, which is why it was important to me to write a book that tells a story about getting to post-traumatic growth so that more veterans can see that actually that's a real thing. And there's people wandering all over the place, whether they're veterans or not, who've been to therapy and have gotten better, have reached post-traumatic growth, but nobody tells that story. I was months into therapy before I found out that I'm actually supposed to get better, that this shit's supposed to work. I was sitting there with my therapist, Nick, and I was like, hey, did I not have PTSD? Because I'm feeling pretty good. And it seems like nobody else gets better. He had to pull out studies from the VA to show me that actually if you commit to the program and you do the homework, you're supposed to get better. And I didn't know that. I was months into therapy. I was like, as Diana put it, the most famous depressed person in America at that moment, or the most famous for being depressed or whatever the hell. And I didn't know. And so the answer to your question is, we have to get across to more people that this stuff actually works and post-traumatic growth is achievable, and we have to help people understand that it really doesn't matter whether you think it's a big deal or not, because my brain doesn't know what your brain experienced and your brain doesn't know what mine experienced, and so ranking trauma out of existence is not actually possible. And all it does is diminish your ability to heal and run the clock and make you miss out on your life when you could have been getting better.
staffer mode, so I want to get
like
you
you go a little shorter so we can.
That was brilliant. That was brilliant. I want to get to everybody.
I'll
who's
try
got
and be
questions for
clippier.
you.
All right, here we go. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm a little short.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I first heard about you when I worked for the DSCC in 2016 when you ran for Senate.
Yeah. What'd you do there?
I did the digital fundraising.
Okay,
So,
cool.
yeah.
All right. Yeah. Kellen said thank you.
I also went to American University. So
All right, cool.
Go Eagles.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, being in politics and in the military, there's a similarity of serving and also hierarchy. So what were the pros and cons of being in both communities?
You mean like what attracted me from one to the other? sort of
Yeah, or what do you think we can do better at within the military or within working in politics?
Whoa, that's a lot of stuff. So let me think about how this. Let me answer it this way, which is what I learned in the military, and then what it set for my expectations as to what that hierarchy would be like, and what that work experience would be like going into politics, and how super wrong I was. So one of the things I loved about the Army is like you were held accountable for things. Like you did stuff, you did it when you said you were going to do it, or people were like, how is it possible that you didn't do what you said you were going to do, right? And then I got into politics, and this could be a shock to those of you who live in the nation's capital, but it was not exactly the same. It was really different, and people would just say things and then not do them, and there was very little accountability. And then the other piece to it, and I think more on point to your question, was as an Army officer, I was trained to take like a lot of pride in what kind of leader I was and how I treated my people. And I took a lot of pride in, I say this with Kellen here, so hopefully she agrees, with being somebody who it was fun to work for and who seemed to care about his people. But more than that, like, I was just shocked at how rare that was, like how much credit I got for that. Because to me, and part of this was, having trauma and feeling inadequate and, as a human, I was always just so amazed that people wanted to come and help me with, when you're running for office, like at its most base level, you're trying to get a job. So imagine the last time you were trying to get a job, and then like a bunch of people came and were like, I'm going to dedicate all my time to helping you, not me, you get a job. Now imagine not like feeling indebted to those people all the time. Like that's how I felt. And then on top of that, I felt like they were helping this person who I didn't have a high estimation of, me, do it. And so I was always amazed in politics whenever people would tell me that their boss was a bad boss. I just never could figure it out, like how you could not just feel indebted all the time to the people who were trying to help you do something that they usually got no credit for. So I guess I wandered around, but I think I got to an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, and I think the cameras can, so you're good.
Alrighty. Hi, my name is Max, 23 years old, entering grad school soon, but not soon enough. I have first a quick question and then a quick thank you. I guess the question is, like you mentioned before, a lot of us have either had, mental health trauma or know people who have been certainly going through it. And I can think of many people in my life, friends, family, who I take a look at them and sometimes I feel like I need to be there to be able to assist, to sit down with them and ask some questions, basically just try to help out the best way I can. But I think a lot of people could also attest to the fact that sometimes when you do try to make that effort, people sometimes get defensive, they'll sort of ignore it, they're just going through a bad day at that moment, but relax, it's not a permanent thing. And for as much as I would love to buy 100 copies of your book and just slide it on over to anyone who I think might need that sort of inner reflection.
The answer, Max, is that's the only thing you can do. You have to buy 100 copies. But go ahead, sorry.
Hey, listen, I'm going to grad school. I'm going to have quite some debt soon.
I'm just kidding.
I would love to add on
I'm
to it.
kidding.
But, sometimes there is that desire to have that conversation, even though it will sort of lead to the cycle. So I guess, would you suggest that people still try to make that effort, even though it may lead to the same sort of result, just to show them at least that we care for you and that we're always there for you? Or would it be more so advocating for better tools, better resources, so that eventually they might either stumble upon the right path or find the right path? And just a quick thank you as well. I was a legislative aide in the Florida legislature over the past year, and I was only able to get one bill passed because I was on the minority side there, but it had to do with veteran suicide prevention. And thankfully we got that passed unanimously. And even though your name's not on the bill, you are a huge influence through and through. So
Thanks, man. Well, you passed as many bills in the Florida legislature as I passed in the Missouri one, so we're tied, and thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a really important question. Like, what do you do when there's somebody in your life who's spiraling and they refuse help, but you... So it's a hard question. It's a big part of why Diana's perspective in the book is so important. And one of her lessons learned from that she gets to in the end of the book is that, your instinct is to jump in with them, like they're drowning. But in reality, you can't jump in with them. You have to provide them the life preserver, but they have to take it. And so what I try to tell people is, yeah, there are things you can do, but you cannot save them. And you have to give yourself that. You have to allow yourself to understand that you can't. There were a lot of people in my life who wanted to help me, right? I could not have been better set up to have a support network, right? Could not have been better set up, which was a whole other thing that like I had guilt about, right? But I was in a great position. Didn't matter. The thing that made a difference is I decided. I got to the point where I was like, I don't want to do this anymore, right? And it had to get pretty bad. Like, the way I refer to it in the book is that rock bottom is the international capital of zero fucks left to give. Like, that's where I was, but I had to get there, and I had to choose, like, to take the leap of faith and say, I'm gonna throw away, potentially throw away the one thing that was going well to go try and save my own life. But I did it. I did it with the help of a lot of people around me, but nobody convinced me to do it. I made a choice. And so you got to let yourself off the hook a little with those people and say, I'm going to do everything I can. Now, the advice I'd give you about what to do, I'll tell you what doesn't work. What doesn't work is trying to convince them that they're totally messed up. They will dig in. I did, big time. They will dig in and they will become entrenched and they will feel personally attacked. I say this because the instinct is to help them see it. Is to be like, can you not see that this is not good what you're doing? You're not present right now. You're not able to do this. And in their mind, they're like, yeah, man, I know that I'm all messed up. You don't have to tell me. And they'll project onto you, and the bad feelings they have about themselves, they will ascribe them to you and feel like you're saying those bad things to them when you're not. But that's what they'll hear. That's what I would hear. What you can do is you can get really curious, and you can ask them a lot of questions that are genuine and that just show that you care, right? So if you're dealing with somebody who's been through trauma, you can make sure they understand that you are a person that not just they can talk to about it. That's one thing. You are a person who is genuinely interested in hearing about it. That's the difference. When you're a combat veteran, I can tell you that you learn pretty fast which stories you can tell to people and have them just listen to them and go, oh, okay, and which stories you probably better keep to yourself because it will change the way they think about you. They will recoil. And you learn it pretty fast. And as a politician, you learn which ones you can sanitize and tell on the stump and people, oh, that's great, and which ones you're not going to tell them, right? And that's true for anybody with trauma. So if you want them to talk about their stuff, they gotta believe he really wants to know. But at the end of the day, they gotta do it. So.
Thanks, Max.
Time for one
We
more?
got time for one more, and then I get the last. So go ahead, my man.
I'll be quick. So my name's Dave. I was actually diagnosed with depression and anxiety about 1.5 years ago. And first I want to say thank you to you because it was your coming forward with your story and a whole bunch of panic attacks that got me to go get help originally.
But mostly me, right? I'm just kidding.
Your story led to the panic
Dude,
attacks.
Yeah. That was good.
So
Sorry about that.
But it's all right. But I realized in therapy that I had these issues for a very long time and just had no idea. So I just want to say thank you, because by you sharing, I shared my story. For me, it was a public post on Facebook. Half dozen guys pinged me afterwards, and they're like, dude, same thing, help me out, right? So there's this
That's
effect
great.
going on that started from you. So thank you for that. 2 quick questions for you. I'll be very quick questions. And if they're answered already in the book, I haven't read it yet. I apologize.
It's okay. We're here to talk about what's in the book, so all these people will buy it. Yeah.
So I have kids. I have twin 12-year-olds. First question is, how did you talk to your kids, if at all, about what you were going through? And then the second question, and maybe it's a little personal, but one of the bigger things that I have.
Not a problem for me.
Well,
Personal for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So one of the issues that I've had is I always feel like I'm not doing enough, and that's where a lot of the depression comes from, right? So I'm not a good enough dad. I'm not around enough. I'm successful professionally, but not right. So with everything that you've done, do you have any of those feelings as well? And if so, with everything that objectively you've done, how do you deal with that?
We're laughing because you're gonna like this book, dude. I almost called this book "Doing Enough."
Okay.
So let me take your questions in reverse order. I had all these symptoms. I had night terrors and hypervigilance and basically paranoia and all this stuff and shame and guilt and all that. But one of the refrain that was in my head all the time was, I didn't do enough.
Yeah.
Frost, have you done one tour? One. How long were you there? A year. I was there 4 months. All right. There were people there when I got there that were there when I left. There were guys who got hurt. There were. I don't have to explain. The Army's like that. I was absolutely convinced I didn't do enough. And there's a myth that we understand in American culture that's been taught to us, which is the redemption myth. We are taught that the way you get better from whatever is plaguing you, particularly as a man, is through singular acts of redemptive heroism. How many of you have seen Top Gun? Okay. Top Gun is awesome. All right? I'm not going to talk smack on Top Gun. I saw Top Gun Maverick. I will see it again. I will see it. I've checked to see how long it's in theaters because I'm going to see it again. It's also very problematic in this sense. Now, I apologize if I'm spoiling the first movie, but you've had 40 years, so. Goose dies. Viper walks in, delivers the news to Maverick. Goose is dead. And does anybody know what the next thing he says is?
Get it back up.
You got to get over it. You got to get past it. You fly long enough, this is going to happen. It's fucking the next thing he says. And then what happens in the movie, which this is a movie, we all grew up on this movie. The next thing that happens is Maverick goes into combat and he kills some bad guys. And he's all better. He throws Goose's dog tags into the ocean and he gets the girl. Happy ending. Cue Kenny Loggins. We're good to go, right? That's what we're taught. And that's what we believe, particularly as men in America. So for me, and I don't know what you do for a living, but it doesn't really matter. In some way, you're seeking to redeem yourself at some point for this stuff. For me, I was like, I didn't do enough. So I guess I'm going to get elected to the state legislature. Then it was, I'm going to change ethics reform and save the state. And then it was, I'm going to save voting rights for the state. And then it was, I'm going to save voting rights for the whole country. And then it was, I guess I'm going to get elected president and save the world. I could have been Bill Pullman in Independence Day. And at the end of it, I would have been like, I didn't do enough. I didn't do enough. And so a lot of my journey in therapy was figuring out what I now know, which is I've done enough. America and I are square. I still do stuff for America. I still care about this country. I still do things, but I do it because I want to do it, not because I should do it. And you can't get there right away, but you'll get there. Before I say something about kids, which you asked, which is a great question, I want to say something about what you said about posting on Facebook. You don't have to be a well-known person to massively affect people's lives by being public about mental health, right? There's 2 reasons why people should do what you did. One, man, it is so much easier to deal with your own shit when you're not hiding it from people. I refer to it in the book as wearing the Jason Kander suit. I don't do that. Part of it, being very public about this, has been very helpful to me because I don't have to pretend about any of this, and it takes a load off. But the other part, the part that helps other people, is everybody's dealing with stuff. And we live in a time where everybody's famous in some way or another. It's social media. You don't even if you're not even on social media, if all you do is tell your coworkers you're going through some stuff, you might save one of their lives, because nobody talks about this. But when you talk about it openly, everybody goes, oh, well, that sounds exactly like me. So it's wonderful that you did that. To answer the question, because I'm going to hurry and get to the last one, to answer the question about how I talk to my kids about it, my daughter is almost 2, so we've not chatted about it yet. But we will. There was an evolution of how I talked to True, my son, about it. True will turn 9 in September. And at first, what True understood, because it was almost 4 years ago that I made my announcement and went to the VA. At first, what True understood was Dad decided to stop. He decided not to try to be president, and he decided not to be mayor because he wanted to be dad more. So we went with that description for, a few years. And then, like 5 months ago or so, when I started to do a little bit of promotion for this book, it was like, I think I need to talk to True about PTSD because he's going to hear about it, And the good thing was at that point, he had been coming to VCP with me. He understood that, sometimes people are changed by going to war. He also knew, Dad doesn't like it when you sneak up on him, right? And so he had these 2 things as a building block for what I talked about. And I sat down and I explained PTSD. And I went through the whole thing. And, this is what happened. I'm one of those people who, going to war made a change for me. And I explained, so Dad has PTSD. And True was like, okay, can you find a Lego with 4 pieces across? Because we were working on Legos. He was like, okay. Got a new piece of information about my dad. He hasn't learned enough to stigmatize it because nobody taught him that. And then when the book promotion really started to ramp up a few weeks ago, he asked me, he was like, Dad, is the book called Invisible Storm because there was a storm in your head? And I was like, yeah, how did you figure that out? And he goes, the cover of the book is just a picture of your head. And I was like, all right, well, you're clearly a genius. And but then we had this long conversation about how I went to a special kind of doctor and I talked about this stuff. And it actually has been an enormous opportunity for me to get to the point of why you asked. Because my wife and I already talked to our kids about emotions and everything, but our kids, we have 2 goals here related to PTSD. One is to not pass on generational trauma, which is something I have to work at, right? I can get frustrated, and I don't want to raise my voice. I don't want to be what I derisively, and shouldn't say it this way, but I refer to it sometimes as PTS dad, I don't want to be that guy, and I work hard not to be, and sometimes I slip up. I'll get upset, and I'll raise my voice, and sometimes you can't sort out whether you're just raising your voice because you're a parent, and it's enraging to be a parent, or because you have PTSD. I don't always know, but I work really hard on not passing on generational trauma, but also on the upside, I have what my great uncle referred to when I went into therapy as a master's in myself. And part of having a master's in myself through therapy is I have a much wider working understanding of my emotions and how to regulate them, and a great appreciation now of the idea that emotions and feelings are important. So my kids are going to have the advantage of growing up feeling like feelings and emotions are not a bad thing. Feeling and emotions are super important. And if you can feel, that's good. And so we're working very hard to make sure that our kids have a very large working vocabulary and tool set of their emotions, and that they take their emotions seriously. Because I hope they don't, but the chances are, like all of us, they will experience setbacks and trauma. My interest is in having them be as prepared for that as possible, and normalizing the idea that when you get an injury of that type, you go and you treat it. So that's the answer to that question.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. This has been fantastic. Thank you. I am going to try to find a novel way to ask the question that was only not asked because you shamed them before somebody got a chance to ask it, which is, we came into the game in 2007, 15 years ago. You did, and when we came in, there was far much more possibility in national politics than I think that anybody sees now, but specifically in Missouri, right? It was bluish. There was a time when, as goes Missouri, so goes the presidential, that, whatever has become of Missouri now. We'll talk about that at another time. But ultimately, do you still see electoral politics as a noble space, a space worthy of the best and brightest of public servants? And just give us some brief, because I see Brett behind us, brief thoughts on the state of where we are politically right now, because it seems so down. Help us, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and, right? So yes, I still see it as a noble profession. But I guess what's changed about my perspective is that I've been out of office now for 5 years, and I've accomplished far more in terms of making an impact on the world out of office than I did in office. And it's not close. And so I think that I can understand to some degree. I have a lot of empathy for the talented young people right now, in which you and I are the age where we stand in front of a crowd and I say young people. The talented young people who are not choosing politics, who might have otherwise, who 15 years ago, if you put them in a time machine and take them back, they might have taken the path that we did, who instead are becoming entrepreneurs or working in nonprofits or in the academic world or writing or whatever. I get that because I'm a nonprofit executive and I feel like I'm making a greater impact. That said, it doesn't mean that the fight is not worth fighting, and I do think it's still a noble path. What I am really concerned about, and you and I were talking about this a little before you all were here listening to us, I'm concerned about what sense of national identity we have and what sense of shared experience we have, because this is the longest period in the nation's history of like consecutive years with no mandatory service of any kind. I'm not saying that we should reinstitute the draft. But what I am saying is that we lack shared experience. That, it's very hard to answer the question, what does it mean to be an American? What do we all share? And it's like, like Don had a great example when we were talking earlier that it's like the federal budget and like not a lot more. I've always said it as like 1 in 3 of us watch the Super Bowl every year and everybody in this room has a view one way or the other on Taylor Swift, right? Like that's not enough. And it means that as long as that's the case, it's going to continue to attract people in a different direction other than elected politics. It's not just the discourse. It's not just the grossness. It's the sense like, can you get anything done that way? The most effective people are not going to go that direction when that's the case. And so I look at it, and here's what, because I want to leave it on an optimistic note, here's what makes me feel better about that, is that while technology and the changes in the media pulls us apart, when I look at Generation Z, I don't see a group of people that are using those platforms to pull their generation further apart. What I see are people who have a sense, whether they can articulate it in every case or not, that things are kind of messed up and it's getting worse, and that it has a lot to do with people not being close to one another. And I see people in rising generations trying to use technology to gain a greater closeness to people who did not grow up the same way as they did, and to have a greater understanding of those people. And if that continues, that makes me feel like things will be better and it will become a more noble pursuit again, or a more pursued pursuit again.
Invisible Storm, A Soldier's Memoir of Politics and PTSD by my only friend from Kansas City, Jason Kander. Thank you all for coming out.
Jason and Don, thank you so much. Great talk. Copies of Jason's book are available.